The Smile, That Cost Everything, Brad Pitt, and the Silent Price of Being Perfect. Everyone saw the smile, that specific smile, slightly crooked, effortlessly confident, the kind that made photographers forget to blink. The world had decided something early about Brad Pitt, and that decision hardened into mythology before he had any real say in the matter. He was the golden one, the untouchable one, the man for whom everything seemed to arrive naturally, as though life had been arranged in advance to accommodate his particular kind of beauty. But that was the problem with being mythologized too early. The myth required constant maintenance, and maintenance over decades is exhausting in ways that never show on camera. This is not a story about fame going wrong in dramatic tabloid-friendly ways. It is something quieter and more honest than that. It is the story of what happens when a man becomes a symbol before he has fully become himself, and what it costs to slowly, painfully reclaim the person underneath the image. William Bradley Pitt was born on December 18, 1963 in Shawnee, Oklahoma. His family later moved to Springfield, Missouri, where his father Bill ran a trucking company and his mother Jane raised three children with faith and practicality at the center of everything. It was a comfortable, ordered, deeply American upbringing. Nothing about it suggested Hollywood, but something about Brad had always existed slightly outside the frame of what surrounded him. Not rebelliously, he was well-liked, social, genuinely warm. There was an observational quality to him that friends noticed even then. He watched people carefully, he cataloged emotion, he noticed the gap between what people said and what their faces were actually doing. He was, without knowing it yet, studying for a career he had not chosen. At the University of Missouri, he enrolled in journalism. He was 2 weeks from graduating when something shifted inside him without warning. He packed his car, told almost no one, and drove west. Destination, Los Angeles. Reason, something he could not fully articulate but could not ignore. Los Angeles in the mid-1980s was both more brutal and more beautiful than the movies it produced suggested. Apartment walls were thin. Rejection was structural. The city had perfected the art of making people feel simultaneously close to everything and permanently outside it. Brad arrived with almost nothing. He drove a limousine, he moved refrigerators, he wore a chicken suit outside an El Pollo Loco restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. The humility of those years would matter later. Not because suffering builds character in any simple way, but because it gave him an understanding of invisibility, the experience of being present in a room while no one looks at you, that would eventually become one of his most powerful instincts as a performer. He studied acting under Roy London, a teacher known for demanding emotional honesty over surface technique. London pushed students not to perform emotion but to locate it, to find the real thing underneath the representational version. Brad was, by most accounts, an uncommonly attentive student. He worked, he listened, he revised. Small roles came gradually. The industry noticed the face before it fully understood what the person inside it was capable of. That ordering, beauty recognized before depth, would create a complicated pressure that followed him for the next decade. The moment everything changed was not gradual. It was almost violent in its speed. In 1991, Brad Pitt appeared in Ridley Scott's Thelma and Louise for approximately 12 minutes of screen time. He played J.D., a charming drifter who passes through the story like warm weather. What happened next was unprecedented. 12 minutes, that was all it took. The letters poured in, magazines demanded covers, the industry recalibrated around a new certainty. This person was going to be enormous. But Brad himself experienced that moment with something more complicated than pure elation. Because when the world decides you are everything before you have fully become anything, there is a particular vertigo in it. You are being seen intensely and constantly, but what is being seen is not quite you. It is the idea of you, the projection, the thing the world needs you to be. A River Runs Through It followed in 1992, then Interview with the Vampire in 1994, opposite Tom Cruise. The cultural moment around Brad Pitt in those years was genuinely unusual in its fever. He was not simply famous. He was the subject of a collective fantasy that had very little to do with him personally and everything to do with what people needed him to represent: youth, beauty, effortlessness, the sense that someone somewhere had gotten everything right. He won People magazine's Sexiest Man Alive in 1995. The designation should have felt like a peak. Instead, he later described it as one of the more disorienting moments of his professional life, because what the title actually named was the completion of a process he had not fully consented to, the replacement of a person with an image. But underneath the image, the work was getting serious. Sesevanen arrived in 1995, and something shifted visibly. Brad played Detective Mills, not with charm or beauty as primary instruments, but with confusion, rage, and a devastating naivety that made the film's final act genuinely unbearable. The performance suggested something the mythology had been obscuring. This was an actor, not merely a face. Fight Club in 1999 pushed further. Tyler Durden was seductive, anarchic, and ultimately empty, a charismatic void who turned out to be a projection of someone else's fractured psyche. The meta-dimension of casting Brad Pitt, the man the world had made into its most glamorized projection, as a character who was literally a projection, was either accidental or the most precise casting decision in 1990s cinema. On the set of Fight Club, under David Fincher's famously demanding process, something was happening to Brad Pitt that the cameras could not fully capture. He was beginning to ask questions he had been too busy to ask before. Who was he outside of what people needed him to be? What did he actually want beneath the layer of wanting to satisfy what others expected? What happened when the performance stopped? Not the film performance, but the other one, the constant one. He did not have answers. He would not have them for years. But the questions had arrived, and they did not leave. The early 2000s brought a marriage that the world treated as a merger of myths. Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston were married in July 2000. The cultural attention directed at that union was extraordinary, not because either person invited it, but because the world had decided it needed this particular story to be true. Two beautiful, successful people became a symbol of something the public projected onto them: the idea that perfection was possible, that happiness could be assembled from sufficient quantities of success and beauty. Inside the marriage, two real human beings were doing what all human beings do, navigating difference, pressure, and the slow accumulation of unresolved tension. None of that was visible from outside. What was visible was the symbol. When the marriage ended in January 2005, the world reacted as though a theorem had been disproven. The scrutiny that followed was extraordinary. Brad was not permitted, in the public imagination, to simply be someone whose marriage had ended. He was required to be a character in a morality narrative, and the role the narrative assigned him was not generous. His relationship with Angelina Jolie had begun on the set of Mr. and Mrs. Smith in 2004. Whatever the full private truth of that period, the public version calcified into a simple moral geometry that followed him for years. With Angelina, he built something genuinely large: a family of 6 children across multiple countries, between film sets and press tours and the logistical complexity of existing as one of the most photographed couples in the history of celebrity culture. Friends who visited the family described a Brad Pitt who was most visibly himself when surrounded by his children. The mythology fell away, the performance requirements suspended. He was simply a father trying to be good at it. But underneath the domesticity, older questions were still unresolved, and new pressures were accumulating. Brad has spoken in interviews conducted years later with an honesty that felt carefully arrived at rather than performed, about the fact that he spent a significant portion of his adult life using alcohol as a management system for emotions he did not know how to address directly. Not dramatically, but consistently, as a private mechanism for navigating the gap between what his external life required and what his internal life was experiencing. He described it as a kind of numbing, a way of getting through the performance requirements of enormous public life without feeling the full weight of them. The problem with numbing is that it is not selective. It does not only quiet the difficult things, it quiets everything. including the capacity to be fully present in the relationships that actually mattered. When his relationship with Angelina Jolie ended in 2016, Brad Pitt was 52 years old, separated from his children, and publicly accused of things that touched the most fundamental questions of his character. It was, by any measure, the lowest point. He later described the period following the separation as the moment when the numbing strategy finally stopped working, when the management system failed completely, and he was left with no mechanism between himself and the full accumulated weight of everything he had been avoiding. He stopped drinking. Completely. He joined a support group and attended for a year and a half. He went to therapy. He sat with the discomfort of being radically honest with himself about patterns that had shaped his relationships in damaging ways, the emotional unavailability, the habitual retreat into charm when genuine vulnerability was required, the tendency to manage rather than feel. He made sculpture. This was not a celebrity hobby deployed for sympathetic press coverage. It was something more private and genuine, an engagement with making physical objects that had no performance requirement, no audience expectation, a space where the only question was what the material wanted to become. He described working with his hands as one of the first activities in decades where he was completely present, not performing, not managing, simply there with the material in the moment without the mythology. Something was being rebuilt, slowly, imperfectly, without guarantee of outcome. The work during this period reflected the internal excavation. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in 2019 gave him Cliff Booth, a man of ambiguous morality, complicated past, and a specific kind of weathered masculine stillness that only becomes possible when an actor stops trying to be liked and starts trying to be true. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. In his acceptance speech, he was funny and deflective in the way people are when they are genuinely moved and slightly afraid of it. But something underneath the humor was visible. A person who had arrived somewhere real after a long journey through performed versions of himself. The performance of the award was Brad Pitt. But the relief in his eyes was something else entirely. It was the relief of being seen, actually seen, not mythologized, for something he had genuinely done. There is a particular loneliness that attaches to people who are desired by millions and understood by almost no one. Brad Pitt has lived inside that loneliness for most of his adult life. The world has needed him to be things: a symbol of beauty, a cautionary tale, a comeback story, a villain, a redemption narrative, and the requirement to serve those needs constantly is a kind of exile from ordinary human experience. What his story suggests, across the full arc of it, is something both simple and difficult: that the performance eventually has to stop, not the professional performance that can continue, and in Brad Pitt's case has continued with increasing depth, but the other performance, the one that substitutes a managed image for a genuine self, the one that uses charm or success or alcohol or busyness as a buffer between a person and their own interior reality. At some point, the buffer stops working, and then you are left with only yourself. For Brad Pitt, that reckoning came hard and late and in public, which made it more difficult and possibly also more meaningful, because he could not perform his way through it. He had to actually go through it. He has emerged in his 60s as something the young man in the chicken suit on Sunset Boulevard could not have imagined, someone genuinely at home in his own imperfection, less interested in being loved by everyone, more interested in being honest with himself. The smile is still there, occasionally, but it means something different now. It is no longer the smile of someone maintaining an image. It is the smile of someone who survived the image and found something more durable underneath it. Not perfection, not myth. Just a person still learning, still searching, but present finally in the actual life rather than the performed version of it. That is the real Brad Pitt story, and it is in the end far more interesting than the myth ever was. There is one final image worth holding, not from a red carpet, not from a premiere, not from any of the thousands of photographs the world has taken of Brad Pitt across 4 decades of relentless visibility. It is from a small sculpture studio in Los Angeles. Brad Pitt alone, hands covered in clay, face showing the specific concentration of someone who has temporarily forgotten that they exist in relation to anyone else's perception of them. No performance requirement, no mythology to maintain, just a man and the material and the question of what wants to emerge from it. Quentin Tarantino, who directed him in both Inglourious Basterds and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, once described Brad's greatest quality in a single phrase: the absolute lack of vanity in the actual work, the willingness to be wrong, the courage of someone still genuinely curious rather than the confidence of someone who stopped questioning himself years ago. That quality, rare in anyone, almost miraculous in someone who has spent 40 years being told he is already everything, is what ultimately separates Brad Pitt from the myth the world built around him. He never entirely stopped asking who he was, and that question, carried honestly across a lifetime, turns out to be the most interesting thing about him. Not the beauty, not the fame, not the Oscar, which recognizes a single performance rather than a life. The searching, still ongoing, still honest, still worth watching.